important clients. And when you do something and get started in the application, you might be an experienced user or you might be new in the application and you don't really know how to set things up. That's why we have an assisted setup now. So you can look for it in the search screen, and then you will end up in the assisted setup window on which you can see a number of parts of the application which you can set up. You can do that by simply clicking on them. And behind the scenes, there is a page in there, the assisted setup page, and also, of course, a table where you can determine what will happen if a user selects one of those links. And the idea is actually also that when you provide new functionality, for example, you're building an extension or you're building an add-on, an ISV solution, or anything in the application, that you hook into that functionality. Now, how does it work behind the scenes from a technical point of view? And there's a table, the assisted setup table. If you look in that table, there aren't only fields in there, but also some very interesting functions you can make use of. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And behind these functions, of course, there are also a number there is some code there available. And as you notice here, when you look at the assisted setup page itself, when you launch it, you will end up in the unopened page trigger, which will trigger an initialize function. And that initialize function, like a setup table, for example, will go and do an initialization. So what you could do, for example, is you could also subscribe here to have your own part of the application set up. Once you select one of the links in the page, you can usually click on them and then a process starts. And the way that it starts is by using an onLookup trigger. And when you click on the name field, the run function is executed. And then behind the run function, you can find code which first verifies if the task was already executed, yes or no. And then if not, some code might be executed. If the task was executed, then we won't bother the user again with any notification or going through the setup again. So you can have a look in there to see how you can reuse that functionality. Now, if you look in the table itself, you'll also notice that there are a number of setups that you can perform, and then if you can select one of these setups, there are a number of ways to define what will happen. And normally it's you can make use, for example, of a destination field. Now, the screenshots I have right here are the ones I also used at my directions presentation in Prague. And at that time, on the preview version of the application, destination wasn't filled in. I didn't verify today if it is the case right now, but just remember there's a field in there you can make use of. Okay. So basically what happens when you select one of the options in the assisted setup, a page starts, which is typically a wizard page. Now let me first go over and do a small demonstration, and for that I will use my browser, which I have right here. I will go into the application, and by the application I mean here our web clients. And basically either you go via the interface or you are warned, but you will go automatically in there, and you can always manually also look for the assisted setup table in here. So you can find some assisted setups which are by default in there, and basically when you select one of them, a wizard starts that guides you through the process, and that wizard has a number of pages and some buttons that you can use. So it's on one hand, it's very interesting to know and that we have these assisted setups. On the other hand, it's also interesting to know, hey, how can I create this type of a wizard page? So let's have a look at typically how you can build a wizard page. It's not rocket science. It's not completely new. The page already existed, or the page type, in previous versions, but right now it's used a lot in the application. So to get started to create a wizard page, you will go, of course, to your page object. You will create a new page. You need to add some steps, so you need to think about which are the steps and that we require in our setup, in what order do we need to go over these steps, because that is used when we will build our navigation. Excuse me. Then at the end, once we have our navigation, we'll also think about an image header, because if you launch a wizard, you might notice that when you are at the last step, the image changes. And then, of course, once you have defined your wizard, it's very important to test it for all devices, because you need to take into account it will be executed on the web client. It might also be run on the mobile client, and even also in the Windows application if anyone is still using that one, so to speak. Okay, so when we create a new page, we will select a navigate page. You can do it via the wizard, you can do it manually. That's the navigate page here in the wizard or in the properties, the page type property that you can set. Next, you will add our steps. We will do that by using groups. Each group represents one step in the wizard. And then the content is, of course, the content to each group that we will provide. So I have a small example in here of a wizard page. You will see the content area. I have my first two groups. I will come back and talk about them later. And then I have actually my step 1, my step 2, my step 3 with some information in there. These are the steps in my wizards. To add navigation, we'll use actions to make it easier and consistent to our users. There will be a back, a next, and a finish action that we'll make use of. They will be displayed, of course, at the bottom of the wizard. And then at the end, we'll also provide an image header, which is typically a media field to show a picture to indicate where we are in our wizard. And that's why we have the first two groups, and we'll use a media repository image in here. And there are already some images in there that we can use. So typically, they're shown here during one of the steps. And then here we have the image that's displayed on our last step. Okay, last but not least, we need to test this for all devices. You know already, and that if you run the application, you have different URLs to go to and to test it on all of the devices itself. So let me just go back one step and do a small demonstration in the application of how we can create such a page. So I will go here to my development environment, which I have right here, and I should have a wizard page. I will just take that into design. It's a simple demo. So basically, if I go to the properties of my page, let me open that. I am using the company information as a source table, and the most important part is that the page type is navigate page. The name in this case is simple wizard. Then I added some content to my page. Basically, what we need here is my step 1 group, my step 2 group, and then my step 3 group. And you will notice that if I go into my steps, so let me minimize this a little bit. When I select these groups, you will notice that the visible property has been set by a variable. First step, visible. Second step, visible, and so on. And then I will use my code to determine when which step needs to be visible. Of course, also when I open my page on the initialization and in the onOpen page trigger, I will also make use of AL code to determine what needs to be visible when. Let me zoom in here a little bit. In order to do that, I will of course also make use of a number of globals which I have available in here. So we'll need to use a number of booleans. First, to determine which steps will be visible. Later, of course, also to determine which buttons need to be enabled, the back, the next, the finish button. And then I'm also using two records that go to the media repository table to determine when which image needs to be displayed. I created some functions, load banners, enable controls, reset controls, and then show this or that step, next step, and then the finish action. And it's behind or in these functions that I program what will happen when we go forward. So if I go back to my codes, and let me zoom in again, apparently he loses that zoom when I move. The load top banners function, basically here, loads some information from the media repository table. These are, as you might see, media fields, and we'll talk about them in the next section. Okay, once they are loaded, and then we will determine when which banner needs to become visible. So let me go home again. In the unopen page, our first step is the start step. And then I will launch my enable controls, which will first reset the controls. And depending on which step I am currently in, I will launch this or that function. So I go to the show start step, show second step, show final step, and so on. And if I go to that function here, you notice that I'm playing a little bit with the hidden properties of certain fields to determine when what needs to be visible. Okay, of course, then the user will start entering information in the first step, and then he or she will click on a number of actions which I have defined. The next action, we can always go back, and the finish action. If I click on the next action, and what we will see is that the next step function will be executed, and this next step function will then determine what needs to happen depending if it's the first or the second or any of the other steps. So we can see an example in here or how you can continue. And if it's the last step, then of course we have our finish action in which you can add some custom code, and then we'll close our current page. Okay, that's all very interesting to know. I might have gone over this a little bit quickly, but I can send you the objects, and there are also some how do I videos available that also go over this again in more detail. So these were the first two steps, working with the assisted setup table and then working with media on with the page wizards. In our page wizard, we noticed that we are using certain media types, and that's what I would like to talk of right now in the next section. We're working with media on records. Okay. To work with media files in the application, like images which we store in the database, to display them in the clients with certain records. Until now, we have always used a blob data type, a binary large object. You like it or you hate it. We add the media to our blob data type fields. And that was it. Performance wasn't that fantastic. Now we can make use of new data types. We have a media and a media set data type that we can make use of. And in the standard application, they're also used a lot. With media or media set data types, we can store images, for example, in system tables, and then we can reference the images via application records or link them to application records. Okay. These media sets were defined or designed for the web client and the universal app. That's where you will find the most usage of them. And you can use them to display images with records on list type pages. For example, when you run a list page and you look at it in the brick layout. Now, what is a brick layout? Let me just go over to show you an example. I will go back here to the application. Let me just close this wizards. And if I go here to my list of items, what you will notice is that by default we have this item list like we had in the past. But if you run the web client, you notice here you have these icons to the right where you can show the big bricks and where you can show the small bricks. And the way the information from the item table is displayed is actually defined in our environment. So if I go, for example, to my development environment, and if I go to the item table, you will notice that if you go to view and then field groups, and that in the field groups we have a brick layout and that we can select. And it's the order of the fields in the brick layout determines where they are displayed here, what information you see, the number, the name, the inventory, and so on. And that all comes from the order of the fields in here. Okay, that's nothing new, but in the latest release, you also notice that if the last field in a brick layout, in this case is the item picture, what I have done right here, and it's a custom field that I added. So let me just scroll down a little bit to the bottom. I have an item picture in here. You notice that this field is not a blob, but a media field. And if it's a media field, it will be displayed automatically here in the brick layout. So that's an advantage that you can make use of. Here you have the small images or the bitmaps. Here you have the big images. And it's not only the case for items. In the past, when you had to demo that, you always had to use the item table. Now, for example, you can also have a look at your customers. If I scroll down in the demo database, we should see some customer faces appearing. Might need to have applied some filters in here. Normally we should see them appearing. If I click on them, they will also appear in here. Apparently in my database, that's not the case. So you can use it in many tables, and this actually you can call design pattern is used also a lot on master tables. So if I go back here, we have our brick layout that we can make use of, and it's used in the two layouts with the full thumbnail or the full image in this case. So When we work with the media or the media set data types, basically we get a much better performance than using a blob data type. And it's also much more flexible in design and also in programming with these data types. We all know that when we were using our blob data types, each time the media type was rendered, it was retrieved from the SQL database, not really very optimal. It required some bandwidth and affected performance. With the media and media set data types, we should not have that, that issue anymore. The client media ID is cached on the service tier, which improves also the response time when we will render the media. Okay, so we use media and media sets on records. In tables, you can use two new data types, media and media sets. Media associates a record like an item with a single media file. For example, media sets can be used to associate one record with one or more media files, like a collection or a catalog. You can do that, for example, if you would like to show a slideshow of images of the items on a card page, for example, or if you have many pictures of your customers, you can also do that, of course. Now, how does it work? We can add media to our records via file using streaming, if you would like that. In the database, it's stored in our tenant media system table of the application database. And each media object is assigned a unique ID, which we can then, of course, also reference. It's usually a GUID and that is used. If we add a media field to a media data type, and then we use the ID. If we add media to a media set data type field, then the file is assigned in the system table tenant media set with a unique identifier from the fields that's created with the first file that we add. So the first one that we upload gets the ID. All of the other ones in the same collection or media set will be associated with the same ID. So that's how it works behind the scenes. There are a number of media types which are supported. Basically, we're using the MIME type. It's an internet standard which is being used to describe the contents of a file. Dynamics NAV supports image data types which correspond to the system.drawing.image class of the .NET framework. If you go into the documentation, or if you have a look at the help, you will notice which image types are supported. I had them here on my slide, but I wasn't 100% sure that that's still the case in the current release. There were some limitations, but I think now we can use almost all of these image types. So how does it work? What do you need to do to get started with these images? First, we need to obtain the media or the files that we would like to use, of course. They need to be somewhere. Then we modify our table object, for example, to include a field with the data type media or media set. So add new field to table, set data type to media or media sets. Add AL code to import the media on our fields, of course. And then we can make use of a number of functions to do that. We don't have to do everything ourselves, of course. Now, if we work with a media data type, what you will notice is that there is an import file function. What can we do with that? Well, we might be able to import an image on a records in the application database. Sounds easy. Import stream is very similar, but then we can make use of an in-stream object. Remember, XML ports can also do that, for example. We have a has value function to be able to detect whether a record already has a media object in it, yes or no. The media ID function that gets the GUID or the global unique identifier assigned to the media object in the application database. Export file to export one, if you would like to do that, and export stream if you would like to use streaming while exporting. Okay, so if you have a look in the application, I already demonstrated that here in the beginning. You will see these in item lists and customer lists. You can also see them on master cards, usually in a fact box. There is a picture image in there. By the way, most of the picture fields in master tables are no longer blobs, but they are working with media or media sets. Not all of them, but most of them are already. Here in the item table, field 92, the picture has become a media set. So basically, if you show an item on a card page, because it's a media set, it could also be a collection of images to do that. Okay, so if you have a look here at the item picture page, the field is in there, you will find some actions that have been defined in that fact box to import a picture, export a picture, delete a picture, and if you want to also to take a picture. Now that take picture action isn't always visible, depends on your client and maybe also your operating system. For example, if you are using, let's say, an Apple device, that button might be visible. On certain other devices, it might not. There is some code behind the visible property. Basically, that happens, or this makes sure that on the page you will see import, export, and delete functions, and then sometimes also take a picture function. Very similar, you can just go and have a look in page 346, for example, item picture to see the actions and the codes after there, and then you can also find some examples of the functions that you can use in the file management code units to upload and download your images, delete them, and so on. So that code is also already in the application. Just have a look at it and use it at your convenience. Here I tried to summarize a little bit that there are a number of system tables that we can use, media sets, and then tenant media set, and also a thumbnail table where the information is stored if you use the functions. If you run these tables, you can see the ID, which is a grid, and you can see a thumbnail, the image type, height, width. You will also notice that you can store them by company. There is an expiration date involved if you would like to do that and make use of that. And then if I go into the tenant media, you will also find some images in here which are used by the default application or in the Cronus database if you install and run that. And here you notice here for which companies, or if it's for all company, that these images are available and used. Then there is also the tenant media thumbnails where you get the ID and the media ID, the MIME type, JPEG and PNG and ENM. Bitmap are supported, for example. Okay, so media I covered. If you have a look at media set, we get a similar set of functions. I will not go over all of them. Import file, import from, or import stream, or very similar than with the media. The media ID function, of course, gets you the global unique identifier. Count might be interesting to use to be able to figure out how many do we have for this record. An export file, and you can, of course, use to export these files if you would like to do that. If you have a look in table 9400, which is the media repository table, in that table you will find three fields: file name, display, target, and image. And for example, some functions which are already in there that you can use to import data, as you notice right here. We make use of the file management. We set some information or attributes of our image, then we use the import file function to import it. So you will have already some examples in there, and if you go and search for where is this used, in this case you will see that it's used already by a lot of pages. Now again, when I did this research, it was in the CTP. I think in the final release it might be used by more objects. Okay, now I come back to my wizards. I talked about them some time ago. On top of the wizard page, we have two groups which by default we add. You can copy paste them from any other wizard page, in which we will use our media repository, the standard image and the DOM image. And if you put those two groups on top of the navigate page, and then you can have your function load top banners, which is triggered sometimes to be able to fetch information from the media repository table. You can use these two image names, and you can also determine which is the current client type that you are using, and then you can determine when to show which image, depending on which step we are in, the last step or any of the other steps, and depending on which clients that we are using. Okay, that was too quick. So if I just go back to my development environment, and if I have a look again at my page wizards, let's take this in design again. These are the two groups and the two fields I was talking about. So in order to do that, all you need are one or two links to the media repository table. And then basically what you can do is you can make use, for example, of this function to load the data. And that's it. And we do that typically in a wizard, because if I go and run my wizard again, let me quickly go here to my home screen where I just I provided the button to launch my wizard. You notice that if I launch my wizard, this is the media repository image that is displayed. And if I click on next, it's still the same image. And if I click on next again, well, I'm on the last step. The next button is disabled. The image changes. You are done. Now we can click on the finish button and the page closes. So that's also an example of how you can make use of these images. So it's used a lot in the default application. I would really recommend you to have a look at that. What I also added in here in my slides are some more examples of code that you can find where media sets are used. If you have a look in Code Unit 8611, Configuration Package Management, you will find some functions or useful functions in there. Is media set field, import media set files, and so on. So you can have a look at those functions. I tried to put them here on the presentation, but of course there is so much code in there. Okay, how can you get started with these images? Well, let me show you a small demonstration. So if I go here again to my development environment, and what I should have here is a very complex code unit, import item pictures. And if I have a look at this code unit, I have basically on the onRun trigger, I will call either the import pictures or the import pictures with stream function. If I look at them, what would I do? I will loop over the items. Well, actually, that should not be a find first. That should be a find set anyway. When I loop over the items, I will basically have a look in an image folder on my C drive to see if I can find an image which has the same name than the item, and if it's a JPEG, yes or no. If I find that, and then I will have a look if the file exists. Yes, well, I will use the import file function on the item picture field, which is a media data type, and I will just store it here with the item. That's it. And the other function, import with stream, is actually very, very similar. I'm using here a create in stream function, in this case on a file variable, and I can use the import stream, in this case here on my media, to import that information until I processed all of my items. If I go in here and let's just have a small look here on my CTEM folder, I should have these images in here. And you might notice that might look familiar. And when I run my code, okay, I'm just clicking now on the Ctrl-R function. The application starts. I should see my message appearing in a couple of seconds ready, of course. And then I can go into the application again. I should be able to go here to the list of items. And then you will notice that for these first items, I also now have these images imported just as a proof of concept. So that's how easy it is to work with these images and these data types that we have available. You can have a look here at what I used. Basically, I have the item in here, and if I look at the other function, I'm also using the item table in this case, and just a very simple file variable. The power is basically here in the media or media set types. I'm just using the import stream functions. So very simple example on how to work with that, but you will find lots more code in the application itself. Okay. A very interesting feature to also talk about is the task scheduler. You might have already seen that by accident. Now, the task scheduler is that mechanism behind the scenes which has been implemented now to support job queues. As a user in the application and job queues, you might not notice that, but in the past, job queues were used in AL codes and were always started using the application server or directly from the client. Now, also here, the AL, the application logic, had a little bit of a loopy logic in there, sometimes keeping sessions open for a long time. So as I usually say in my trainings, this was suboptimal or a suboptimal implementation. And the problem was that sometimes something happened, like a network outage or SQL Server error, and then basically the queue would stop, and then you had to manually restart it or implement some kind of auto restart every each time. Well, with the new implementation, jobs can be restarted. There is a tolerance for certain types of errors, and very interesting, you can execute multiple tasks at the same time. There is some kind of parallelism implemented, and you can distribute the load between multiple service tiers, and some tasks will be picked up automatically. So You can still continue to use the job queue entries like you did before, but the old application server is still available, but basically I'm not expecting this to be there in the future. I did not hear any official documentation or information about that, but it's what I personally think. In the future it might disappear. So it's still there if you upgrade to make use of it, but in the future it might disappear. Behind the scenes now there is a new table. It's called scheduled task. Basically you do insert and deletes in that table and to create new scheduled tasks. You can manage that via L code, and that's the most interesting part. There is a new object available, task scheduler, with some new functions that we can make use of. Okay, we'll discuss the functions in a few moments. The trick right now is that the system knows automatically who created the task. And then whenever it needs to stop and restart that task, it will do that. Another service tier might pick up the task when it stopped, but it will run it with the same permissions that the user that started the task. And that's very interesting. The existing job queue functionality is also modified, so it runs on top of this new mechanism. And basically it doesn't really need the job queue table anymore, so you might not see that anymore in the application. Okay. Some more information. Categories, job categories are still supported, so it will execute jobs with the same category at the same time. Priorities are not supported at the moment, as I understood. It's just first in, first out. They might be supported in a future update or released. And if you look at the configuration for the service tier, in the configuration in the administration tool or in the file, there is a new tab. It's called Task Scheduler, and you can turn it on or off for a specific service tier. And you can also determine how many concurrent tasks you can execute. What it means is that you can now configure a specific service tier to run certain background jobs. So you can have, let's say, a number of service tiers for your users, others for web services, and then maybe 2 or 3 to run jobs in the background, which is very interesting. There is more. By default, for a service tier, the configuration is turned on, so you don't need to turn it on yourself. You need to turn it off if you don't want to have it available for a specific service tier. So you don't need to configure any job queues to make the background jobs work. It will also keep any threads alive on the server when there is nothing to do, so it will not just disappear or stop working when there is nothing to do. When the server restarts the service tier, and the background execution will resume automatically, fantastic, after a couple of minutes, and the service tiers might need to synchronize and try to figure out amongst themselves who should run which job. But there is some logic behind that. There's more. You can use categories if you would like to serialize certain jobs. So if you don't want certain jobs to be run at the same time, for example, posting jobs to avoid certain logging issues or deadlocks, you can actually see that when a job is started, the system will check if the job has a category code. If so, it checks if there is any other job running with the same category code, and if so, the job will reschedule itself for some seconds later, and that's also built in to the code. Okay, so for us developers, the task scheduler enables us to control certain operations. We can determine when we would like what to be executed. We can schedule that. What do we schedule? It will be a code unit and or a report at a certain date or time. Tasks will run in the background, like background sessions in the part that we had, for example, in previous versions. When you have a look in your symbol menu, or if you start typing code, you will find the task scheduler data type that you can use, and here we have some functions we can play with. There is a create task to add a new task. A set task as ready, so you can determine the ready state of a task. A task cannot run until it is ready, so it should be ready before you run it, not after. Task exists to check whether a specific task exists, yes or no. Cancel task, to cancel a task, of course. So how do we set up a task? Very simple. You create a code unit that contains the logic you would like to schedule. There can also be a second code unit, the failure code unit, that will be executed to handle certain things if the task fails for any reason, if there is an error in there. So you can trap that like a try-catch. Once you have the code unit, you add code, of course, to the application that calls the create task function to schedule your task to run those code units. The create task function in that case can be used to specify the earliest date to run the task and whether it is in the ready state, yes or no. So what will you do after you add a task? It's recorded in the scheduled task table. If the task is ready at the time it needs to start, when a background session is started, the task code unit is executed. You can view the session in the session event table. If there is an error, well, and there is no failure code unit, then the retry flow is just initiated. If there is a failure code unit that has been specified, well, the error is passed to the failure code unit and that one is executed. If the failure code unit doesn't handle the error or fails itself, then the retry flow is also initiated. So you notice they thought about everything here. When can a task fail? Well, for example, the company can't be opened, there might be a SQL connection or a transient error in the database, or the service tier is restarted while a task was being run or executed. You can view these errors in the event log of the computer where the service tier is running, so you can check that. If there is an error, unless the task is interrupted by the failure code unit, so the task is catched, the service instance will rerun the task. There is a retry flow. I don't know why it's decided like this, but basically 2 minutes after the first failure, 4 minutes after the second failure, 15 minutes after the third failure, and subsequently up to a maximum of 10 times, after which the task is cancelled. So that's how it works. So the task runs in a background session. There is no user interface, so it's very similar than the start session function we already had. If there is a dialog box, don't worry, it's suppressed. And the session will run using the same credentials used when calling the code, which means that if the task is picked up by another service tier or it runs something, the user that's used to run that code needs to have permissions on the code unit and any other associated objects with the operation of your code unit. It's very important. Here I try to summarize the information. So a service tier will read from the table, execute your code unit, and once it's executed, it will delete the task. In the app database, there is some information stored here on different tenants, and we can make use of a number of functions: create task, task exists, cancel task, and set task as ready. If you have a look here in the service tier settings, these are the two settings you can use. This one by default is enabled, and here we have the maximum running tasks, and that's also here. Okay, we have the task exist function, create task function that we can make use of, set task, ready, cancel task that we can play with. And in the scheduled task table, you will also find that information. Here you find an example. If you have a look in the code unit 453, the DNQ code unit, you will notice, okay, job queue entry, system task ID equals, and what will we put in there? Well, the result of the create task function. This create task function will use a code unit, job queue dispatcher. If something goes wrong in there, then the failure code unit error handler will be used. This is the company for which you do it, the earliest start date, time, and the record ID you associate with it. You will find some examples of how to use these also in the job queue table. Okay, now I have a demonstration on that. So if I go to the application, not really sure I have enough time, but I'll show it anyway. So what do I have in here? If I look at my task scheduler, I thought I had a page in here normally. Apparently not. So let's just go here to my code units. I have a my tasks code units. And basically you can use a create task function to determine what needs to happen. I can say which code unit needs to be executed, 50,000, the failure code units, and then some information. You can also say set task as ready as from a certain date time, and then create your task. And then you can, for example, also display a message to determine if a task is ready, yes or no. Here I have an example of the run code unit, some logic in here, do something. In this case, I'm inserting something into a table, and then also an example of a failure code unit in here. I did something, voila. Now, this is not very, very good code. It was a quick demo, that's why I'm not running it. I have some better examples later, but you will find them also in the existing application. Okay, now my two favorite topics, notifications and then later the time series API. Notifications is also a new framework that we can use. There is a new data type, a new type available. You can use it to notify and very importantly guide users. And that's the main message here in the new version of NAV. We have the page wizards, the assisted setup and notifications to guide users. They don't have to figure out themselves how to fix a problem. Now we can guide them. We've all been in a situation when you talk to a user and that they say, well, NAV gives me an error message and in the message it says me exactly what goes wrong. Why can't he fix it himself? Well, now we have something at our disposal to do that. So as a developer, we have full control of the context in which a notification is shown. We can withdraw them. We can include actions in there to fix the problem. You will notice in the symbol menu, we have some new options, some new functions we can use. I will talk about them later. And there is also a scope for our notifications. So with notifications via AL, we can program a non-intrusive way to provide the user with information in the web client. And notification is not the same than a message. Why? Messages are modal, notifications are non-modal. So a message means that we show something and we need to click, we need to address it. Notification is basically optional. There is no need for an immediate action in here. For example, we can say, aha, did you notice that credit limit has been exceeded? Okay. I'm going quite fast, I know, but I have lots of information still to process. So if you go into the application and create a new sales order, you will note that if something goes wrong, a notification is triggered. In this case, we don't have enough inventory. We can see that in here, and then there is some action on which we can click, and that's an example of notification. And if you select the action, a window opens, and okay, we can do something with that. So in the user interface, notifications will appear in the notification bar, and the user can dismiss the notification if they want to clear it. So it's similar also to a validation error, and it's always at the top of the page on which the user is currently working. If the user does not dismiss it, they can, for example, take action. Okay, and we can provide which action and provide them also with extra information. We can have multiple notifications. That's also where the fun is. A notification will remain. So basically, if we have multiple notifications, they will appear in a chronological order from top to bottom. They will remain for the duration of the page instance or until the user has dismissed the notification. If you have a subpage like a document page and you raise one on a subpage, then they will be displayed in the same notification bar of the main page. Any validation errors on the page will also be shown first in the same area. Okay, so as developers, we can use notification and notification scope, data types and functions, and we can write code to determine what will happen and how it will happen. So we have a message function and to specify the content of the notification. There is a scope function to specify the scope, local or global. The send function to send a notification to the user interface or to the client. Add action to determine which action or actions you would like to have available. And then the very funny ones or the interesting ones is set data to add some attributes or extra information, key value pairs to our notification, and get data to retrieve that information from notification. I really like these two, and not because I like RDLC reports, because this is done much better. And of course, there is also a recall function to recall a notification. Okay, so when we create a notification, we will use a message and a send function. The message function defines the notification, the send function raises the notification and sends it to the client and displays the content. Here a very simple example, my notification.message, and then I will send it. What I can also do then is use add action and set data, but of course the send function should always be the last one in your code. We can have two different scopes, local and global. I have some information about them. Basically, a local scope will appear in the context of a user current task, which is the current page, and that's a default one. And global scope, for the moment, forget about it. It's not yet implemented. It might be implemented in a future release. It's as simple as that. So here I have a notification in the local scope. and I send it. We can add actions. That's very interesting because we can have an interactive discussion with our user by using these actions, and then they can dismiss a notification. Also here on an action, we can specify a code unit and provide that code unit with extra information, and then also some business logic which needs to be executed. So let me show you an example. I have my notification, then I will add an action, and if I select this action, that code unit will be executed. If I select another action, that code unit and that function in that code unit will be executed, and I can send my notification, and that's really, really interesting. So, which are the steps that we need to follow? You create a function in a new or an existing code unit, which should be a non-local one. The function should have a notification data type parameter to be able to receive the notification object. Then we add code to the function to handle the action. We specify the code unit and function in the add action function call, and that's it. So these are the steps and that we go through. So I might have gone through too quickly via this slide. Okay, so we can have more than one action on notification. If it's local scope, we can have up to 3 actions, and in the future, global scope 2. Okay. We can use set and get data functions to add data to a notification, and we can use the set data to add the data. And you will do that in key value pairs that you can determine yourself. And with the get data function, you can retrieve the information again. So here we have an example. I have my message. This is the scope. Set data created is a string I provide within the current date time. The ID, GUID, which I create, some actions, and I send it. And then this code will get the information. For example, get data, what isn't created, get data, what is an ID. So we can retrieve that here, as you can see in this example. Okay. The demo I will skip. I saw the code. If I have some time left on the end, I can show you a number of demos of notifications, but they are used a lot in the application. And I see I only have about 10 minutes left, and I really would like to show you also time series API. By the way, if you would like to have a look at some of the existing examples, there is the item availability check page where you will also find some examples on set and get data functions and how to populate notification and so on. So there is a lot of very interesting code already in the application itself. Okay. As you notice here in the role center notification management, there are also some functions you can have a look at in order to play with these notifications or maybe even subscribe to them. Okay, there is also a My Notifications where as a user you can determine to enable or disable certain notifications. So I would like to emphasize this. If you do that, of course, also integrate with that page so a user can dismiss when or not to receive certain notifications. The idea is not to annoy them with too many notifications. Okay, so some examples of notifications in the application again. This is a topic I also would like to introduce you to. And don't worry, there is also another why video about this that explains it in more detail, but the time series API. I think we have all heard about machine learning, and as from now on, we can make use of that in NAV. We don't have to really know much about machine learning to be able to use that in NAL code because there's an API that we can use. Now, let's say that you create software. Usually, smart guy creates an algorithm, the user inputs a value, and the system applies an algorithm and does something. Okay. To be able to create a good algorithm, you need to be a specialist, and you need to be a domain expert and need to have your knowledge about the industry. And the worst part is that someone should update the algorithm now and then, either by changing the setup or by changing the code. And that's not always that easy. Machine learning can help you to do that in a different way. Based on historical data, it can analyze that data, find certain patterns, determine an algorithm to use, and then predict something. The user can input some value, the system will apply the model which was used, and then return the results. Okay, and then the system can use that new information to adjust and retrain the model. That's how it works in theory. Now, in practice, what will happen is that it's not completely true. because the system tries to analyze the incoming data in different ways. It can be very intensive in terms of resources. So we don't use this approach. Instead, we will help the system in our API to determine which algorithm to use, and then the system will do the rest of the work. Okay, so machine learning, one of its most popular how do you say that, applications is basically forecasting based on historical data. And we have many algorithms that can do that. Now, the Microsoft team has selected 5 of those algorithms that we can make use of. And they are in a machine learning experiment. And we can just use that. And it will determine which is the best one to use. So all we need to know which experiment on machine learning on Azure do I need to use, and how can I API, how can I connect with that experiment. And then the data we get back, we can also see some information about the quality of that data. And of course, the important part here is you need to have enough data to be able to do good predictions. Okay, so we will make use of an API as a developer, and we can just integrate and use that API. I will show a demo in a few moments. Now, what can we use this API for? Well, the advantage is we don't need to retrain our model. Everything happens when we submit data. And there are about 300 tables in our application that contain date and decimal fields, and these are the interesting tables we can use for this API, for time series predictions. So what I have right here is an example of the model on the machine learning experiments. You can go on Azure, have a look at how it works. But what will I do? Based on some data in my system, I will create a purchase order, because the system will say, or will actually predict, well, based on your historical activity, and next month you will need to buy 3 of this and 1 of that. Okay, how does it work? I'll just skip these 2 slides. You create a model, then you publish an endpoint, then you get predictions, and this so the information will be used. So then you can use the information. So the idea is to get predictions so we can use the information in an advanced way. Now, if you go to this URL, this is where you will find your model. And if you do that, you need to open it in machine learning and copy it to your workspace and then validate the experiment. Now, basically what you can do is if you click on the link, you will end up on this website. It's one that was created for AX, but we can also use it for NAV. Basically, you click on Open in Studio. By the way, there's an API key in here and an endpoint. You can't use these ones. You go to Open it in Studio, then you have your own studio, and then you can recreate your own API key. And these are the ones that you can use. And there are 2 free versions you can make use of. And if you do that, let me just click on this button, wait a couple of seconds, and then we'll see this thing opening. And then you will see the machine learning experiment in a few seconds. We're almost there, bear with me. It's still opening, and then we should see what I had on my slide a couple of seconds ago. Voila. Here you have our machine learning experiment. Basically, we will run it to train it once, then deploy the web service. Once we have deployed the web service, we can get back the API. Now, in the How Do I video, I've explained by default how to do that. Okay, so we need the API key and the request URI, and then we will get predictions. Now, how will this work? Let me just demonstrate that. So what do I have in here? I have a code unit. And where is my code units forecast? This is my code units. Okay, in the code units, what I have in here are 2 text constants. I have my URI and I have my key. These are the ones that they have in here. Of course, they are here in a text constant. Maybe a setup table would have been a better idea. So what will I do? I will run my code unit. So if I run my code unit, let me do that. What we see is you will calculate the forecast for this item. And based on the historical data of the last 11 months, it will predict next month you will probably need 3 of these for this item, based on that machine learning experiment. So I did a calculate forecast, and here you notice that we can make use of a time series library code units. We provide our information, we do a prepare data. Once data has been prepared about our item number, posting date, quantity, so we have the historical information. We then get the prepared data, we launch a forecast, and we get the information. Okay, that's a simple message. Now we can continue to also do this for multiple items. I have 2 minutes left, so I will try to hurry a little bit. If I run calculate forecast bulk, we'll not see it for one item, but we'll see it for multiple items. A page should open, of course. It doesn't because I forgot. No, here it is. Here is my page. So you will notice that for all of these items in next month, month 13, so to speak, we will require maybe 3 of this and 1 of this. So these are actually the predicted values. And then you also have some deltas. It might be 3 plus 1 or minus 1. Okay. Yes, I can stay, Rick. So what we have right here is this function to do a forecast for many items, and I just presented you with the results here at the end. So this is the forecast bulk. We have our initialize function, we have a prepare data function, do the forecast, then I run my page. But basically, instead of running the page, we can use that information from our time series forecast to create a purchase order. If there are any items for which the machine learning experiment has predicted that we might need some of them in the future, well, instead of looking at the results, let's just create a purchase order. And if I run my code, voila, now I have a purchase order for these 2 items. So this is a very silly or simple example of how you can make use of these predictions. You might have noticed also already, if you go to items, there is also in the application a forecast, and that you can set up. So for every item, it can predict how many you will need in the future, but in the Cronus database, there is not enough information to do these predictions. There's also a video available on how you can set that up.
Excuse Stephen, it's Rick here. Everybody, we have reached the hour. Stephen has graciously said that he can hang in there for just a little bit longer. So you're quite welcome to join us. Just be a few minutes more. Stephen, thank you. Back to you.
Okay, it's no problem. I usually go a little bit over time. It's my fault. So here are some examples of how you can make use of these time predictions. Now, I went over the code quite quickly. I will also make the code available afterwards. Now, I have it summarized here in my slides. So to get predictions, we call the API. The API will run it and also check the quality of its own predictions, and it can learn from that. So if you have a look at the time series library, we have some functions: an initialize function to set up the connection, prepare data to transform table data from NAV into a data set for the experiment, forecast to run the machine learning experiment on Azure, and get forecast to get the resulting data set of the forecasted values. Excuse me. And we can use that information, as I demonstrated, to create a purchase order. And the demo, I have just done that. So I demonstrated that. The last part here in my presentation is a little bit information about resources. So I tried to summarize some links where you can go through. There is the Get Ready page where you'll find lots of How Do I videos. The Learning Portal is also an interesting one to have a look at. There is the Developer and IT Pro help. It's an MSDN, but it's a different URL than the help for previous versions. I know. And then on MSDN, it's a little bit difficult to search in there. Help is not as complete as it was in the past, but you will find lots of information about notifications and task scheduler and all of those topics on there. There is, of course, also a YouTube channel with the How Do I videos, and I think about most of these topics you will also find some How Do I videos. And interesting to mention, Gunnar Gaston on his blog also has some very interesting blog articles, for example, about notifications and applying them in the context of creating an extension. So also very interesting to have a look at his blog. So I went over a couple of topics: assisted setup, which is important to think about. It's a new way to interact with the user, not having them knowing how to set up everything. We will guide them through the process. How will we do that? We will do that using a wizard. The wizard makes use of media on records. To schedule tasks automatically, we can use a task scheduler. The job queue already automatically uses that. Basically, we do an insert in the scheduled task table. And then, my favorite, we have notifications we can make use of to guide the user when something goes wrong. We have our time series API. Okay, it's like a little bit back to the future at this moment, but we have an API in the application. We can make use of it. Currently, it uses that one experiment. You could be inspired by that via that API, change it a little bit to also make use of other experiments or create your own machine learning experiments. And we'll also do that in the future in the context of Power BI, which also has an interface to machine learning. So all of the, let's say, the bits and pieces in the puzzle are coming together, and it should be really fun to play with those. Okay, I hope I was able to give you a small overview on some new AL capabilities we have in the application. There are many more. I try to pick out the most interesting ones. So if you have any questions, of course, you can always send them to me or to Rick or to any of the people of Liberty Grove and NAV Skills. We'll be happy to answer them, and my slides will also be available. Before we go over to any questions, I would like to wish everybody happy holidays, happy Christmas and New Year, and all of those things. And I think I still have some time to do some Q&A. So if there are any questions, you can ask them. You can type them in, and I will try to answer them if I see them appearing.
Stephen, thank you.
Yes.
I'm still catching my breath here. You covered an awful lot of ground. We are a little over time. We do have a question coming in.
Okay.
How can one user schedule a task to run as another user so that he gets notifications on, for example, job failures? How are job failures reported to users now?
Well, a good question. If you use the job queue, it still works as before. And if you use the task scheduler, basically when you create a task, it is created with it will be run with the permissions of that user, even if it's picked up by another service tier. I don't think you can change it in between. You can't say it needs to be run with the permissions of that or that user. So I don't think you can at this moment, but to be 100% sure, I will write it down anyway to make sure that I'm not wrong about this. But I don't think you can at this moment.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Well, we are running quite a bit over now. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Stephen, once again, thank you. And everyone on the call, happy holidays, Merry Christmas. We will certainly be putting on more webinars in 2017. Join us then. Happy New Year, everyone.
Thank you very much also to you, to Rick, and wish you also happy holidays and a great New Year to you and to everyone here.
Thank you. Goodbye, all.
Thank you. Goodbye.